Yeah, we can get started now. So, hi everybody, welcome. This is our introduction to anxiety management webinar. So, we're going to really talk about anxiety and kind of what it is, how it manifests, the differences between kind of normal anxiety and clinical anxiety and problematic anxiety. We're also going to talk about some strategies to help manage it. So Vanessa's going to be presenting, and I'll let Vanessa introduce herself. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name's Nick Fink. I'm a registered psychotherapist and the founder and director of Mantra Psychotherapy, psychotherapy clinic in Toronto. We do virtual psychotherapy, and we specialize or focus in on LGBTQ plus issues, emotion regulation, identity. Anxiety is another big thing, as well as relationships and so a lot of other stuff, but those are kind of our main focuses. So I'll hand it over to Vanessa for now, and we'll get started with the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Vanessa, and I'm a registered psychotherapist qualifying. I'm also a practicum student completing my practicum at Mantra Psychotherapy. I'm really excited to be able to give this webinar to you today on the introduction to anxiety management. And yeah, as Nick mentioned, the goals for today's presentation include introducing you to how anxiety is an exaggerated nervous system response, and really looking at some practical strategies that you can implement to manage it. And so here's just a brief overview of what we're going to be covering today. So some topics that we'll explore: what is anxiety? We're going to look at what are known as thinking traps that actually perpetuate one's anxiety. We're going to look at ways to manage anxious thoughts and those thinking traps more effectively. We're going to look at some practical skills to be able to cope effectively with those anxiety symptoms. And we're also going to have a brief discussion on self-care, some self-care techniques that can help with anxiety. Self-care really is tied hand in hand with the management of many mental health related conditions, and anxiety is one of them. And so, first of all, what is anxiety? So, anxiety really is a normal response to real or perceived danger. However, it's when that anxiety becomes overly intense and frequent that it may start to impact one's mental well being and functioning. Anxiety symptoms can manifest in many different realms, including in psychological symptoms. We would see that in increased nervousness, worry, just a feeling of being on edge. With the physiological symptoms, that would be things like a rapid heart rate, tightness in the chest, muscle tension, sweating. And in the realm of behavioral symptoms, that would be things such as avoidance of those situations that might trigger one's anxiety, increased irritability, and restlessness. And so this diagram here just shows, what an average amount of anxiety looks like. We don't want to be completely without a level of anxiety. It is, evolutionarily beneficial, to be able to perceive threats and perceive danger. It's when that anxiety kind of gets outside of those normal levels, as we see more towards the right of this diagram. This would be the amount of anxiety for those with anxiety disorders, and really starting to get into that level of clinical anxiety. The clinical anxiety is more intense and frequent than that normal response to perceived threat or danger. And that clinical level of anxiety can really create significant distress that interferes with and impedes one's daily functioning. It can lead to depression, burnout, and substance use, just to name a few challenges. So now within the realm of anxious thoughts. So the anxious thoughts are really important to look at and understand more fully within this anxiety response. Anxious thoughts are typically distorted and based on more emotional reasoning rather than a level of logical or rational reasoning. Anxious thoughts often are focused more so on negative scenarios or outcomes. That emotional reasoning really causes us to make assumptions that are quick and extreme due to the activation of the fight or flight response. Um, The fight or flight response is really concerned with getting us out of that, immediate danger or getting us out of harm's way. So it leads us to make impulsive and more drastic decisions or engage in more drastic behaviors. Um, the emotional reasoning just causes us to make those assumptions that are quick and extreme because that fight or flight response has been activated. So, because of that, we can often misperceive emotions due to their intensity as being factual when this is not always the case. Because that fight or flight response is concerned with mitigating or preventing that immediate danger, it selectively focuses on information, that's around preventing that threat. It's not really focusing on assessing whether that threat has a realistic possibility of occurring. And so within this realm and within the realm of anxious thoughts are a specific type of anxious thought known as a cognitive distortion. Cognitive distortions are emotion-based assumptions that are essentially mental shortcuts. So again, these often don't account for all available evidence, but rather evidence that relates to a perceived threat or negative outcome. And so we're going to take some time to look at some of those cognitive distortions and some of the more common ones that we can often see in those with anxiety.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here. When we have these anxious responses, so the fight or flight system gets activated, we have a part of the brain, and we'll look at it in just a moment, called the amygdala, that gets activated. It's like the emotion center, it's the fight or flight response. It's an older part of the brain. It's more focused on mitigating and preventing danger, like Vanessa said. But when that gets activated, it actually affects the functioning of our prefrontal cortex, excuse me, which is part of executive functioning. It's responsible for that. So that's kind of why we engage in these mental shortcuts, because we're more focused on survival, or our brain is more focused on survival rather than looking rationally and critically and pulling things apart in the evidence. It's just shortcut, very quick, fast kind of responses to prevent danger. So think about if a tiger is chasing you in the wild, that part of the brain will get activated, and we don't really have time to focus on, okay, well, what is the tiger thinking? Is he gonna do, jump at me or whatever? Like it's really just focus on getting away, the fight or the flight, right? Because obviously most animals, or including us, probably not be able to fight a tiger. So there's a flight response. So that's kind of what happens, and that's why we engage in these cognitive distortions. So we go into preservation mode, survival mode, and take these shortcuts really to think quickly and to prevent danger, which doesn't always work in our complex world that we have, especially a social world where things can be ambiguous and very nuanced, right? And they require that prefrontal cortex to do that rational thinking and looking at all that evidence. So that's why we do these exercises that we'll talk about to engage that part of the brain, to mitigate some of the fight or flight response and to keep it a little bit more balanced.
Absolutely, yeah. And, all of these cognitive distortions, really work to that, mental shortcut and not taking in, all of the available information. And so just looking at some of these a little bit more in depth as well. So catastrophizing, kind of what the name suggests, thinking of catastrophes, fixating on the worst possible outcome that could occur. So we often begin to think that the worst possible outcome is much more likely to occur than it actually is. With overgeneralizing, that relates to just making general assumptions about someone or something based on a single or small number of experiences. With personalization, that is believing that we're responsible for things that are really outside of our control. So, for example, my partner is having a bad week. I must not be doing enough to support them. So, really making it something personal. If we see someone else kind of having a reaction to something, then we really take on what our level of responsibility could be in that, when that's not always a really accurate sort of perception. With jumping to conclusions, that's determining the facts or meaning of an event with minimal evidence. And this can include mind reading or deciding what others are thinking based on minimal evidence, or what's known as fortune telling. So just concluding the outcome of a situation before you've gotten there, based again on minimal evidence. With emotional reasoning, that's assuming that our emotions equate to how things are in reality. So, for example, I feel guilty, so I must have done something wrong to be feeling that. With should statements, that's believing that things ought to be a certain way. So I should always smile when meeting someone new. I should, always work as hard as I can. I should never make mistakes, things in that realm. With dichotomous thinking, that's thinking in that all or nothing or black and white terms. So oftentimes, words such as always or never come up when describing an occurrence here. I never get recognized for my work, or people always ignore me. So really discounting any sort of in betweens, and really just kind of seeing it in those black or white terms. With minimizing the positive and amplifying the negative, this relates to giving more weight to the negative aspects of things than to the positive aspects. And we often do this with feedback that we receive from others, with our successes and failures. If we have some sort of an evaluation at work or something, for example, we can be told 4 or 5 really positive things about our work. And, if there's one sort of constructive, criticism in there, then oftentimes that's what we tend to focus on, and really sort of discount all of those other positive things that we were told in favor of that less positive thing. And yeah, are any of these jumping out to anyone as being typical distortions you engage in? These are all really common ones that come up with that anxiety response. And so now that we've covered the symptoms and issues related to anxiety, we're going to explore how we can better manage those anxious thoughts. And so there is a process that's known as examining the evidence. So, really examining whether you're engaging in those cognitive distortions can be, really helpful to sort of challenge them. So we can challenge distorted assumptions by asking, is this a fact or an assumption? Is there another way that I could interpret this? Would this assumption of mine hold up in court? And I particularly like this one, and I like the analogy of the legal system, so to speak. We're really examining the evidence as though we're in a court case. The goal here is to check whether the assumption is objectively verifiable, and this really helps us to differentiate between facts and assumptions. And then the next step within this process would be to examine the evidence that supports the assumption, as well as the evidence that refutes it. And again, this can be thought of as the process that happens in a court of law, whereby the prosecution and the defense are stating their cases. So if we kind of go through that with this example of an anxious thought, so my boss got upset with me, which means I'm getting fired. So, looking at the evidence on both ends of the spectrum here, what would be evidence that supports this anxious thought? Okay, my boss was upset with me. My boss questioned my ability to perform in my role. But then, on the other hand, if we look at evidence that doesn't support that anxious thought of, getting fired, my boss has praised my work several times before. He rarely criticizes it. My boss mentioned that he would like to train me further, which indicates that he has the intention to keep me on his team. So there's some evidence here that can really refute that, immediate and snap judgment of, oh, I'm getting fired. And then with step 3, reframe the negative thought and use that information from both sides. What conclusion can you make that is more balanced and realistic? So, an example of a reframed anxious thought with that example we looked at, my boss was upset at me, which means that he expects more from me when I do this type of a project, but he still really values me as an employee. And so notice the difference in how you feel when you examine this more balanced thought versus the more emotionally charged one. More irrational or unbalanced thoughts really lead to more negative emotional responses compared to a more balanced thought and, being able to work on a more balanced emotional reaction. And another really helpful strategy in managing anxious thoughts is what's called a thought record worksheet. So we can dive a little further into this. And so using this worksheet really helps to keep us on track and helps us to review the evidence in a more concrete way. And once we have enough practice with this, whole process, we can usually do it in our head. So, there's a few categories here that we keep track of, in those anxious moments. And so, really looking at uh, what the trigger was or what the activating event was that led to that sort of cascade of thoughts and the emotional reaction. So what happened, where, when, who, with, and how, really engaging in the process of what that situational trigger was. As a result of that situation, what was the emotion or the body sensation that you experienced as a result of that? What emotion did you feel at that moment in time? How intense was it on a scale from 0 to 100? What did I notice in my body, and maybe where was that showing up in my body? As a result of that, what unhelpful thoughts were coming up? What went through my mind? And usually this is a what if statement, or possibly within the realm of some of those cognitive distortions that we looked at earlier. And then the next couple of steps are what we just practiced with facts that support the unhelpful thought. What are the facts? What facts do I have that this unhelpful thought is totally true? And on the other hand, what facts do I have that the unhelpful thoughts are not totally true? Is it possible that this is my opinion or an emotion at play rather than an actual fact of the situation? So, as a result of going through all of those processes, now we want to look at the alternative thought, the more realistic or balanced perspective. Really kind of taking a different perspective. What might someone else say about this situation? Is there another way that I can look at this? If a friend came to me with this situation, what would I say to them? What advice would I give to someone else? And then as a result of going through that process and formulating that more balanced thought, re-rate the emotion and the body sensation. What am I feeling now? How is this sort of resting with me now on that scale from 0 to 100? And engaging in this exercise and creating those alternative thoughts that are healthier and more rational often does have a great effect on how you end up feeling about the situation. The more realistic thoughts, rather than the unhelpful thoughts or the thought traps, work towards changing your perception of an event that may start off as overwhelming or challenging. But with practice, you'll hopefully be able to find that you're capable of dealing with such events as they come up. Now we're going to get into some aspects of self regulation. We're going to look at how we can align and regulate thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that really interact to create that cycle of anxiety. And so within this diagram, we see, oh, there we go. Within this diagram, we see what's called the cognitive triad. So this shows how our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors all like reciprocally interact to create that anxious response. The overarching theme of cognitive behavioral therapy, which analyzes this interplay, is really that it's not an event or situation that directly causes our anxiety, but rather our interpretation or view of that situation leads us to form often irrational or unhelpful thoughts that really provoke unhelpful emotions and that directly influence our behavior. So, targeting such thoughts is the first step in this chain reaction to lessen the anxiety or to lessen those anxious symptoms. So coping with stress and adversity, we have natural coping mechanisms that serve to protect us and those natural survival responses, and all of these depend on our upbringing, our past experiences, personality factors. These natural coping mechanisms may work for a time, but they can become maladaptive over time, and so it's really important that we continue to refine them to ensure adaptivity with the situations that we find ourselves in. And so, just to briefly look at some healthy versus unhealthy ways of coping, the unhealthy mechanisms, such as avoidance, substance use, impulsive behaviors such as shopping or gambling, increased social media use, and increased scrolling, these unhealthy mechanisms really work to sustain that cognitive triad cycle, and that makes it that much harder to break. Engaging in the healthy responses, such as exercising, getting social support from friends and family, practicing meditation or self-compassion exercises. Engaging in all of these healthy responses really works towards rewiring our brain, at the physiological and endocrinological level, that can work towards mediating anxiety symptoms and effectively target that maintenance cycle. So, for example, exercise releases endorphins, that makes us feel good. Social support releases oxytocin. Meditation activates the parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest system that really calms our bodies. And all of these help to regulate that overactive fight or flight response that comes up with anxiety.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here again. With avoidance, that's probably the most common one that we would see, right, with clients with anxiety. Often, right, it's protective, right? If I'm afraid of something, I know I have negative beliefs, negative thoughts about it. Like if I go to this party with these people, I'm going to be ostracized. Nobody's going to talk to me. I'm going to have a bad time. People might be rude to me. The avoidance maintains that negative thought and those beliefs, right? So it kind of keeps that going. And then the more that we do that, right, we get stuck in that cycle and we never challenge those beliefs, right? So we never look at the other evidence because we don't have it, because we haven't done it, we haven't experienced it. Experiential evidence is always the most effective. It's more effective than even just kind of cognitively thinking of the opposite evidence. When you experience it, your body feels it, you understand it, it gets stored in your memory, there's a meaning to it. So it's really important to manage that avoidance, and we can do that with those healthy coping skills to be able to manage the anxiety so that we don't need to avoid as much.
Yeah, that really provides, that effective evidence to really be able to target that whole cycle and provide evidence to the contrary in that way. And with this next slide, yeah, so Nick had mentioned earlier about the role of the amygdala, and the amygdala is this structure that you see here within the brain. It's part of the brain's limbic system, and that really works to hijack the brain when that threat is perceived. It is involved in regulating emotions, including anxiety, and is responsible for leading us into the fight or flight response through a rapid release of hormones that form that stress response. So, of course, that has evolutionary benefits, but in the long term, such overproduction of those stress hormones can really wreak havoc on the mind and body. And when it hijacks the brain when that threat is perceived, yeah, like Nick mentioned earlier, the prefrontal cortex receives less resources and less information, and then there's challenges with executive functioning, including focus and critical thinking. And this just provides some further information on that fight or flight response. So there's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses as part of this response. And so the fight response is characterized by aggression and the urge to fight back against a perceived threat. So some examples of this include shouting, bullying, insulting, threatening, aggression, arguing. The flight response involves the urge to escape or avoid the perceived threat. And some examples of that include avoiding, withdrawing, worrying, overworking, substance abuse. The freeze response involves becoming immobile or freezing in the face of danger. So, some examples of this include indecisiveness, numbing, shutting down, dissociation, your mind going blank. And finally, the fawn response is characterized by appeasement and the urge to please others in order to avoid harm. So, some examples of the fawn response include people pleasing, over apologizing, conflict avoidance, high agreeableness, over forgiving, and a lack of individuality.
Yeah, and just on that, do you mind just switching back to the slide, Vanessa? If you don't mind,
Mhm.
thanks. Yeah, just on that, these fight responses they tend to be kind of learned, right? So when we have some type of adversity or stress, anxiety in our past, especially in childhood, we learn in a way, or the amygdala learns, right? It's not as conscious; it's more unconscious and more adaptive. So we learn to use these responses and kind of choose which one might be the most effective, right? So in a home where a parent is very critical, very kind of putting down the child, there's no control, right? They've taken all that control and power, right? The child might, even engage with the fawn response, so kind of people pleasing, trying to appease the parent or caregiver, just to kind of mitigate some of that risk and that kind of that stress. The freeze response tends to be when most responses don't work, right? Or the other responses don't work as well. It's just, okay, I can't fight, I can't run away, I can't please them, right? They're just not hearing me, they won't respond to that. I'm just going to shut down, right? So withdraw, don't move, right? If I move in terms of if I do anything, if I say anything, whether it's good or bad, it's not going to work. It's going to make things worse. So it's a preservation, just shut down, right? The flight response, definitely the avoidance is there, right? With anxiety, it's very common, running away from the danger, because anxiety often has the idea behind it that this risk, this danger is not manageable. I can't deal with it, right? So the running away is the only part. fight response can happen with anxiety, but often it's not as common as I've seen as a therapist than the other responses, especially the fawn response, the freeze response, and the flight response.
Mhm. Yeah. And, in line with those responses and with that anxiety response, we're going to look at some evidence based coping skills that you can try to manage that. And so we have a list here and we'll kind of go through each of these in turn. So, mindfulness and meditation. Mindfulness is a quality, whereas meditation is a practice. So, mindfulness is really focused on paying attention on purpose to the present moment with non judgment, and meditation is a technique that an individual uses to train their attention and awareness in this way. With deep breathing, this helps to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so that rest and digest response again, leading to a calming effect. Because anxiety can cause rapid and shallow breathing that oftentimes we're not really aware of in the moment, practicing deep breathing can really help to counteract that and to slow that down. Seeking social support helps us to feel more connected and is actually one of the most important predictors of mental health. Relaxation techniques help to regulate intense emotions, really work to calm the body. With grounding techniques, these help with practicing mindfulness, keeping our mind in the present moment, similar to an anchor. Journaling is really effective to help us connect with our thoughts and emotions. It leads us to better understanding of ourselves and easier processing of emotions. And self-compassion really helps to counteract the negative or critical thoughts about ourselves that oftentimes come up in this response and that really work to promote those negative emotions and sustain the cycle in that way. So, all of these evidence based coping skills are great for targeting the underlying nervous system response, which can really become amped up due to anxiety. And these coping skills help to regulate this response and to just promote overall wellness.
I will add one part of that. Often anxiety is a feedback loop, right? There's physiological sensations, and then there's cognitive parts of it, right? And we
Mhm.
interpret the physiological sensations in a certain way, and we might have a an association, right, in our brain and our body, right? When we feel that anxiety coming up in our body, then the overthinking might start. We might associate that with panic. Then we might kind of feedback, right? So we have the cognitive part of catastrophizing, the distortions, which make us more stressed and anxious, which activates more of that stress response in the body, which then in creates more distorted thoughts, more anxious thoughts, and panic.
Yeah, really leading into that whole vicious cycle as well. So this is a breathwork exercise that we can quickly try together. So before engaging in this, just take note of any tension or stress or anxiety that you're feeling in your body. So basically, so we'll wait for the ball to go back down. So as the ball climbs up the stairs, inhale, and then as it goes back down, exhale. And we'll do this a couple times. Inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. So just note to yourself, re-rate your sort of stress level. Did this help to sort of mitigate any anxiety or tension that you were noticing in your body? Did it help to get your breathing, back on track? This is another really good technique as well. So this is in the realm of grounding. This is the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. So by focusing on sensory experiences, you can ground yourself in the present moment when anxious thoughts or emotions start to creep up. This really helps to distract us and get us out of our head in this way. And so it involves looking around and observing 5 things that you can see. Just being mindful and spending roughly 15 seconds observing aspects of each object, the shape, the color, perceived weight, perceived texture. Next, you touch 4 things that you can feel. So find and notice 4 things around you that you can feel, such as the chair under you, a pen, your wallet, piece of clothing on your skin. Next, you listen for 3 things that you can hear. So tune into your hearing and identify 3 sounds. Could be birds chirping, traffic going by outside, a clock ticking, or a fan whirring. Next, you find 2 things that you can smell. Could be coffee, candle, scent of laundry detergent on your clothing. And lastly, notice one thing that you can taste. Maybe you have gum or you're drinking coffee, you can taste the toothpaste in your mouth. So this is really helping to, anchor in the present moment by utilizing all of our senses. And another really important topic to mention within anxiety and mental health management as well is the topic of self care. So, self care really helps us to preserve and enhance our well being. Self care can be daily activities and habits that we intentionally engage in to promote wellness. They really help us to refuel and recharge because that chronic stress, from the overproduction of these stress hormones and the overproduction of that fight or flight response can be really draining and impact our health. So engaging in self-care can help to reduce burnout. The old saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. Self-care is really important to be able to, find those activities that really fill your cup back up so that you're not continuously, running on empty and feeling the effects of that burnout physically and mentally. Self care enhances our overall well being, reduces stress, increases our resilience in the face of stressors. It helps us to manage symptoms of anxiety and depression. It can help to increase our productivity and focus. Um, Self care, it's not a luxury, it's really a necessity for us to be able to lead a healthier, happier, and more fulfilling life. And with our self care plans, they can be unique to each individual. What works for some people may not work for others, and that's completely okay. It's really about finding activities you can engage in that work for you and feel good for you. Self care plans can be updated and modified over time in order to meet your needs. And self care doesn't have to be overwhelming. I think that's a really common misconception with self care and engaging in self care. But an important piece to self care really is the intentionality to practice it. And a lot of these self care activities really aren't all that time consuming. Meditative practices can take 5 or 10 minutes, when you first wake up in the morning or before you go to bed at night. You can journal for 10 or 15 minutes. So yeah, self-care is super important and doesn't have to be an overwhelming process. Just incorporating a few activities here and there, even for a few minutes, is really great to help to refuel us in that way. There's a really good TED Talk I found as well that discusses some of these aspects of self care and emotional hygiene and some of the processes of anxiety that we've really been talking about. So I don't think we're going to have time to play it here. It's about 15 minutes, but I'll just say the name of it in case anyone wants to look it up. It's called How to Practice Emotional Hygiene, presented by Guy Winch, and it's a really great video that discusses. The aspects of emotional hygiene, some of the stigma associated with mental versus physical health, and some of the thought processes and their consequences similar to what we've been discussing here. So, if anyone wants to look that up and watch it on their own time, I would highly recommend it. And oh,
Oh,
sorry,
just
go ahead.
yeah, no, I just pasted it in the chat here in the YouTube chat. So if anybody wants it, then you can just go there.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. And so now we're going to look at some ideas for, practicing the mental, emotional, social, and physical self care. So within the realm of mental and emotional self-care, this can be anything, doing mentally stimulating or challenging activities, engaging in hobbies and interests of yours, managing stress, utilizing the mindfulness and meditation, intentionally limiting that social media use. Recognizing and addressing our emotional needs and setting boundaries, with ourselves and with others in order for us to be able to achieve those. Self-compassion, journaling and self-reflection, really working on challenging the distorted thinking and similar mechanisms that we've looked at throughout this presentation. Taking time away from work and noticing when we need some of those mental health breaks. Learning new things. All of these are really good to fill up our cups. In the mental and emotional realms. With social self-care, it's really important to maintain social connections and a social network. That social element is really important, and as stated earlier, is often a huge predictor of our mental health as well. So nurturing close relationships, practicing those relational skills, spending intentional time, with partners and family and friends, being vulnerable with safe people, being able to open up and lean on people that we're close with, and maintaining regular communication with others in person, not just online. That's a really important element of filling our cups back up in the social atmosphere as well.
Yeah, I will add as well, being vulnerable and having close relationships with other people, right? Friends and people in our life, right? It's great to have them, but it's also really important to be able to feel safe, to be vulnerable, to have emotional closeness with people. That gives us a sense of not being alone. We can be around 100 people but not feel close to anybody and still feel really lonely. So that piece of connecting, right? A lot of people do struggle with vulnerability, especially with anxiety, because vulnerability opens us up to being hurt, right? When we're open and vulnerable with people who are safe and they show us that they're safe and they validate us, they care for us, even just listen, right? Make us feel that it's okay to be vulnerable with them, right? We feel
Mhm.
less alone, and we actually challenge some of those anxious thoughts, maybe around vulnerability, right? If I tell people this part about me, if I show this part of myself, they're going to reject me, right? Well, challenging that through vulnerability in a small way at first, and then building up. So working with a therapist is really helpful for that. We work with a lot of clients, and that vulnerability piece can be difficult. So helping to be okay with being vulnerable, to challenge some of those distorted thoughts, and to really find out kind of what you need, right? And in that vulnerability, how close do you want to be with certain people? What do you want to share with them? Right, and kind of just exploring that with a therapist can be really helpful. So just, yeah, another really important piece.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then getting into the realm of physical self-care, anything from getting enough exercise and movement, proper sleep and sleep hygiene, really important, proper nutrition and eating habits, personal hygiene, maintaining our health, and going to those healthcare appointments as needed. Proper rest, especially when unwell, because we don't want to get into that point of further burnout and continuously pushing ourselves past, what feels comfortable and healthy for us. As well as limiting substance use. So all of these fall within the realm of physical self-care. And it's so important to engage in, all of these realms, the physical, the mental, emotional, social. Self-care really is a holistic process. So it involves many component parts, as one's overall health and well-being encompasses many aspects. And thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, we're getting into the wrapping up section here now. And so we covered a range of topics today. We looked at what is anxiety, anxiety symptoms, the difference between normal versus clinical levels of anxiety, some techniques for management, and of course, the importance of self care. And yeah, I'll just reiterate again that anxiety management really requires that holistic approach, and involving biological, psychological, behavioral considerations. So I hope that this presentation was really helpful to illuminate, the important considerations with anxiety and with anxiety management, and practical steps that you can take, day to day. And yeah, feel free to follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more helpful mental health tips. We have a newsletter as well you can sign up for news, updates, tips, and resources. And if you're interested in a free 15-minute consultation with one of our therapists, then you can go to our website, mantrapsychotherapy.ca, and look up our therapists and the availabilities and all that. And if you have any further questions or comments, then you can feel free to email those to info@mantrapsychotherapy.ca. And thank you so much. We have a few minutes for some questions as well, if any come in.
Yeah, feel free to send your questions in the chat if anything comes up. You can also send an email to us if it's if you want to have a more private question sent. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. It's actually our first webinar, so if you liked kind of what we provided, please let us know, and we would love to provide more. Next week we do have one more webinar. It is on mental health and wellness tips for members of the LGBTQ plus community. So we're going to do that next week at the same time on Thursday. But yeah, otherwise, if there's a lot of resources in our resource pack that we had sent out. If you didn't sign up and you are watching this on YouTube afterwards as a recording, just send us an email. I'm happy to send that resource pack out to you. Because there's lots of great stuff in there, and we cover a little bit more than we did in the presentation. So yeah, feel free to do that. Another thing that I'm not sure if we mentioned was we have a lot of different blogs and articles on our website, so you can go and look at that. We have a few blogs on anxiety. Some are written by myself, some are written by Vanessa. So yeah, feel free to go check those out, and sign up for our newsletter, because we do provide extra resources to people who subscribe. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. If any questions, please go ahead and put that in the chat. We'll wait a couple more minutes, but otherwise, thank you so much. Yeah, so it doesn't look like there's any questions. So again, yeah, feel free to email them if you do have them and you want to send them over to info@mantrapsychotherapy.ca. Otherwise, we hope you have a lovely day, and thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Vanessa, for the lovely presentation on anxiety. So again, if you wanted to get on a free 15-minute phone consultation with any one of our therapists, and including Vanessa or myself. Vanessa's offering sessions at a discounted rate as a student. So yeah, if there's some budget considerations, that's something to take a look at maybe. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much.